Medieval Europe wasn't just castles and knights. Between 500 and 1500 AD, some truly horrifying things happened. Doctors drilled into living skulls, animals stood trial for murder, and the fear of the dead turned funerals into battlefields. Stick with us to check out 25 documented cases that will shock you. Chapter 1, Medieval Medicine and Torture. Number 1. In southwestern Germany between the 6th and 8th centuries, archaeologists discovered 8 skulls with holes drilled directly into the bone. 7 of those patients survived the procedure, which means they lived through having a metal drill twisted into their skull without anesthesia. This wasn't some rare accident. Trepanation was a standard medieval treatment for headaches, epilepsy, and evil spirits. Doctors believed drilling a hole would release the demons causing the illness. The survival rate was surprisingly high at 78% during the late Iron Age in Switzerland, but imagine the pain. No morphine, no sedation, just a surgeon grinding through your skull while you're strapped to a wooden table. One skull labeled C8, dating from 990 to 1120 AD, shows a perfect circular perforation at the bregma, the soft spot where the skull bones meet. The edges healed completely, proving the patient lived for months or years after the surgery. Medieval doctors got good at this because they practiced on the living. Number 2. Thomas Becket, Archbishop of Canterbury, was murdered by 4 knights inside Canterbury Cathedral on December 29, 1170. King Henry II had complained about Becket publicly, saying, "Will no one rid me of this turbulent priest?" The knights took it as an order. They burst into the cathedral during evening prayers, cornered Becket near the altar, and hacked him to death with swords. One blow was so violent it sliced off the top of his skull, spilling his brain onto the stone floor. This wasn't torture in the dungeon sense, but it was a public execution designed to send a message: defy the king, and not even God's house will protect you. Becket's blood was collected by monks who believed it had healing powers, and within 3 years, he was declared a saint. Number 3. Joan of Arc was captured by Burgundian forces in 1430 and handed over to the English. At just 19 years old, she faced a rigged trial for heresy in Rouen, France. The English wanted her dead, but they needed the church to approve it. For months, she was interrogated daily, threatened with torture devices, and kept in chains in a dark cell. She was denied a lawyer, denied witnesses in her defense, and forced to wear men's clothing, which was then used as evidence of heresy. On May 30th, 1431, she was burned alive at the stake in Rouen's marketplace. Witnesses said she screamed for water and called out to Jesus 6 times before the smoke suffocated her. Her executioner later said he feared damnation for what he'd done. The church reversed her conviction 25 years later, but Joan was already ash. Number 4. During the Black Death in the 1340s, groups of religious fanatics called flagellants marched from town to town across Europe, whipping themselves until their backs were covered in open wounds. They believed that public self-torture would convince God to stop the plague. These weren't random acts. Flagellant processions were organized events with leaders, schedules, and crowds watching. Some towns even invited them in, thinking the displays of suffering would save the community. The flagellants used leather whips embedded with metal spikes, striking themselves hundreds of times per session. Infection from the wounds often killed them before the plague did. The church eventually banned the practice in 1349, but by then, thousands had already died from self-inflicted injuries. Number 5. Medieval physicians rarely touched their patients. They diagnosed illness, by examining urine, feces, and blood samples that were collected and sent to them. The actual treatment, bloodletting, cutting, cauterizing, was left to less educated barber surgeons. If you had leprosy, the process was even worse. You were forced through a fake funeral. A priest would declare you dead to the world, throw dirt on your head, and ban you from ever touching a healthy person again. You were still alive, but legally and socially treated as a corpse. Lepers had to ring bells so people could run away, and they were sent to isolated colonies where they slowly died from infection, starvation, and neglect. This was called spiritual care. Number 6. Between 1250 and 1265, Italian surgeon Theodoric Borgognoni wrote a 4-volume treatise called Chirurgia that promoted early forms of antiseptic practice and surgical anesthesia using a mixture of opiates and herbs. This sounds progressive, but here's the catch. Most surgeons ignored his advice for the next 300 years. Instead, they continued using boiling oil to cauterize wounds, which caused excruciating pain and often led to fatal infections. Roger Fregari of Parma composed his treatise on surgery around 1180, but even his methods were brutal by modern standards. Amputations without anesthesia, stitching wounds with thread soaked in wine, and packing open injuries with moss and animal fat. The survival rate for major surgery in the medieval period was less than 50%. If the surgery didn't kill you, the infection would. Chapter 2, Strange Laws and Punishments, number 7. In 1386, in the French town of Falaise, a pig was dressed in human clothes, chained in the town square, and publicly hanged for killing a child. The animal had its snout, ears, and one leg mutilated before the execution to match the injuries of the victim, because the law demanded that the punishment reflect the crime. This wasn't a joke or a carnival stunt. Animals in medieval Europe could be put on trial, assigned a lawyer, and sentenced to death as if they were people. Town leaders believed that if they didn't punish the pig, God would punish the whole community. Number 8. In 1474 in Basel, Switzerland, a rooster was put on trial because it laid an egg, something considered a sign of the devil. People believed that such an egg could hatch into a basilisk, a legendary monster capable of killing with its gaze. The bird was officially charged with the heinous and unnatural crime of laying an egg and was found guilty. The sentence was brutal. The rooster and its egg were burned alive in the town square to prevent the monster from ever being born. In medieval logic, killing the animal was a legal form of exorcism. Number 9. In late medieval Germany, the shame flute turned humiliation into a weapon. Musicians who played badly, workers who cheated clients, or people accused of gossip could be locked into a heavy metal collar shaped like a flute, with their fingers clamped to the front as if they were playing it. The victim was then paraded through the streets while crowds laughed, spat, and threw garbage. The device didn't just hurt the neck and wrists, it destroyed reputations. In a world where honor meant survival, public ridicule worked like a slow social death sentence. Number 10. Trial by ordeal turned justice into a dangerous game of chance. In some regions, a person accused of theft or adultery had to plunge their hand into boiling water or hold a red-hot iron bar and walk several steps. The hand was then bandaged and examined days later by a priest. If the wound healed cleanly, God had supposedly proven their innocence. If it festered, they were declared guilty and punished, often with mutilation or execution. Infection, not truth, decided many verdicts, but people genuinely believed God controlled every blister and scar. Number 11. In parts of medieval Europe, bakers who cheated customers faced a very specific punishment: the ducking stool or public pillory near their own shop. If a baker sold underweight bread, authorities could tie them to a chair and dunk them repeatedly into a river in front of their neighbors, or lock them in a wooden frame while their bad loaves were nailed up as evidence. The message was simple: steal even a little food, and the whole town will watch you suffer. That's why the baker's dozen tradition, giving 13 loaves instead of 12 to avoid accusations of short weight, became a survival strategy, not generosity. Number 12. Sumptuary laws controlled what ordinary people could wear, turning fashion into a crime scene. In 1363, the English crown issued rules that said only nobles could wear certain colors, fabrics, and fur, while commoners were banned from dressing above their station. A merchant's wife who wore silk or a servant who put on fur-lined garments could be fined or forced to strip the clothing in public. The idea was that you should be able to see someone's social rank from a distance. Clothes weren't just style. They were a legal label. Chapter 3. Everyday horror in medieval life. Number 13. In 944 AD in the Aquitaine region of France, around 20,000 people, nearly half the population, died from what they called holy fire. Victims experienced horrifying symptoms. Their limbs turned black, their flesh felt like it was burning from the inside, and they suffered violent hallucinations. The Annales Xantenses Chronicle from 857 AD describes it this way: a great plague of swollen blisters consumed the people by a loathsome rot, so that their limbs were loosened and fell off before death. The cause wasn't demons or divine punishment. It was ergot, a toxic fungus that grew on damp rye grain. People were being slowly poisoned by their daily bread, and the church responded with prayers and relics instead of throwing out the infected grain. In Paris around 1129, an outbreak was declared cured by the relics of Saint Genevieve, a miracle celebrated every November 26th as the Feast of the Burning Ones. The real miracle would have been burning the rye stores instead. Number 14. Fire destroyed medieval cities with terrifying regularity, and the architecture guaranteed it. In 1137, a fire in Hangzhou, China, destroyed 10,000 houses in one event. In 1253, the Great Fire of Utrecht in the Netherlands burned for 9 consecutive days and consumed much of the city. In 1327, the fire of Munich destroyed 1/3 of the city and killed 30 people. These weren't accidents. They were inevitable. Medieval towns were built with wooden frames, thatched roofs, and narrow streets that acted like chimneys once flames started spreading. Most families cooked and heated with open fires inside their homes, and a single spark from an overturned pot or candle could ignite the entire neighborhood in minutes. Lübeck, Germany, burned completely in 1157 and had to rebuild from scratch. Even after introducing a fire safety system in 1276, the city couldn't avoid being devastated again centuries later. Number 15, court records from 1372 in England reveal how a metalworker named Thomas de Wald was caught sharing a bed with his former servant while forcing his wife and children to sleep downstairs. This wasn't a scandal in the tabloid sense. It was evidence entered into a legal dispute that exposed the messy, uncomfortable reality of medieval homes. Most houses had only 1 or 2 rooms, and servants, apprentices, family members, and sometimes animals all slept in the same space. Privacy didn't exist. Relationships between masters and servants were complicated and often exploitative. But nobody talked about it openly unless a court case dragged it into public view. Inventory records show that wealthy households might have curtains around the master's bed, but servants slept on cheap straw mattresses called paillasses that were considered so worthless they weren't even listed in official records. Number 16. In 994 AD, southern France experienced what historian Mézeray called a gruesome outbreak that killed nearly 40,000 people from ergot poisoning. This time, the gangrenous form dominated. Victims watched their fingers, toes, hands, and feet turn black and literally fall off their bodies while they were still alive. The disease was called ignis sacer, holy fire, because people believed they were being burned by God's judgment. Local saints were credited with miracles when outbreaks subsided, but the real reason was seasonal. When fresh grain replaced the infected rye, symptoms disappeared. An Assyrian tablet from around 660 BC even warned of a noxious pustule in the ear of grain, proving humans have known about ergot for millennia, but medieval Europe chose superstition over science. Number 17. Medieval crime reports are filled with bizarre, brutal details of daily life. In one case, from 1300s England, a drunk man returned to a closed inn and demanded more wine. The woman running the inn opened a small peephole in the door and told him to leave. Instead of walking away, he swung a hatchet into the door, right where her face had been seconds earlier. The case went to court, not to punish the drunk, but to decide whether the woman had been legally assaulted, even though the door blocked the blow. These records weren't meant to be history lessons. They were legal evidence, but they accidentally preserved snapshots of how violent, unstable, and terrifying everyday interactions could be. Number 18. Ergotism epidemics were so common in medieval Europe that at least 83 documented outbreaks occurred between the 9th and 20th centuries. The disease had two forms: gangrenous, where limbs rotted and fell off, and convulsive, where victims suffered seizures, muscle spasms, and psychotic episodes that looked exactly like demonic possession. Convulsive ergotism was recorded as late as 1928. The outbreaks were concentrated in cold, damp regions of Central and Eastern Europe, where rye was the primary food source. Despite linking ergot to contaminated rye as early as 1626, major epidemics in 1770 and 1777 forced France and other countries to finally introduce food safety legislation. For centuries, governments and churches chose to ignore the science even when they knew the cause. Chapter 4. Archaeological Discoveries. That's shock number 19. In 2006, archaeologist Matteo Borini was excavating a plague pit on the Italian island of Lazaretto Nuovo, 2 miles northeast of Venice, when he found something that stopped him cold. Among the bones of 16th and 17th century plague victims lay a female skeleton with a brick wedged into her mouth. This wasn't an accident or collapse of the grave. The brick had been deliberately forced between her jaws while her body was decomposing. Borini identified this as a Nachtseher burial, a vampire prevention ritual. Medieval Europeans believed that plague victims could rise as undead creatures that chewed through their burial shrouds and spread disease by consuming their own flesh. The brick was meant to stop her from feeding and spreading the plague further. Borini called it the first vampire grave studied from all angles: archaeological, forensic, and folkloric. The woman wasn't a criminal or a witch. She was just a plague victim whose neighbors were terrified enough to mutilate her corpse. Number 20. In 2014, archaeologists in Plovdiv, Bulgaria, unearthed 80 skeletons in a necropolis dating to the 15th and 16th centuries. One skeleton stood out. It had a large stone fragment jammed into its mouth. Similar burials have been found throughout Italy, especially among criminals and plague victims who were considered at risk of rising as the undead. The practice was so widespread that it became a standard burial ritual in certain regions during plague outbreaks. The logic was brutal. If you believed the dead could wake up and spread disease, you physically blocked their mouths to keep them silent and still in the grave. This wasn't folklore passed down in stories. It was an organized response written into community burial practices. Number 21. Near the southern Polish town of Gliwice, construction workers stumbled onto graves that archaeologists later described as deviant burials. The bodies had been decapitated, and the heads were placed between their legs. Eastern European tradition held that suspected vampires should be beheaded or alternatively hung from a gibbet until their heads fell off naturally. In another Polish cemetery near Drosko, 6 individuals were buried with iron sickles placed across their abdomens and stones positioned beneath their chins. The sickles' sharp edge and the weight of the stones were meant to prevent the corpse from rising, or more practically, to deflate the bloated bodies of decomposing plague victims who looked like they were breathing. These weren't isolated cases. Each step was a precaution built into the funeral itself, turning burial into a defensive ritual against the dead. Number 22. Just outside Erfurt, Germany, researchers from Leipzig University announced in January 2026 that they located what they believe is a Black Death mass grave from 1350. Historical records from the region describe 11 mass burials containing 12,000 plague-related deaths. But until now, no one had physically found the sites. Using ground-penetrating technology and soil analysis, the team identified a roughly 33 by 49 by 11.5 foot site filled with disturbed sediment and mixed soil layers. Drilled core samples pulled up fragments of human bone mixed with soil from different geological layers, proof that bodies were dumped quickly and covered in haste. Radiocarbon dating confirmed the remains date to the 14th century. Medieval authorities believed in miasma theory, which held that disease spread through bad air rising from decaying organic matter, so they buried plague victims as fast as possible to stop the vapors. The team's discovery shows that mass graves weren't carefully planned cemeteries. They were panic-driven pits where hundreds of bodies were thrown together without ceremony or dignity. Number 23. In 2017, archaeologists working in Warham, Percy, England, uncovered evidence of what they initially thought was cannibalism. The bones of multiple individuals showed knife marks consistent with decapitation, dismemberment, deliberate breaking, and burning after death. The team considered several theories. Were these people outsiders who were killed and mutilated? Were they cannibalized by starving villagers? After years of analysis, researchers concluded that the best explanation was fear of the living dead. The bodies had been systematically processed, cut, burned, and broken to prevent them from rising from their graves. This wasn't a war crime or a famine response. It was a medieval community taking extreme measures to protect themselves from neighbors they believed could return as revenants. The discovery reveals the dark side of medieval beliefs and shows how fear could turn funeral rites into something resembling a horror scene. Number 24. In a field outside an abbey in England, archaeologists discovered a rectangular pit containing the remains of 48 individuals, 21 adults and 27 children, all placed into the mass grave at the same time. The team had been searching for a medieval building when they uncovered what appears to be a mass burial of the medieval poor. The bodies were stacked without coffins, without markers, and without individual graves. This discovery shifted the focus of the dig from studying the wealthy elite to revealing the brutal reality of how the poorest members of medieval society were discarded in death. Most historical records focus on nobles, kings, and wealthy merchants because they left behind tombs, wills, and monuments. The poor left nothing but anonymous bones thrown into communal pits, forgotten until centuries later when archaeologists dug them up by accident. Number 25. In 2008, archaeologists uncovered a 4,000-year-old grave in Mikulovic, Czech Republic, that shows deviant burial practices predate the medieval period by thousands of years. The body had been staked, decapitated, and covered with stones. While these practices are often associated with vampire burials, they were also prescribed punishments for criminals, suicides, plague carriers, and witches. The challenge for archaeologists is distinguishing between a body that was feared as a vampire and one that was simply executed and humiliated after death. In many cases, the treatment is identical, which means the line between criminal punishment and supernatural fear was thin or non-existent in medieval thinking. Communities didn't need a reason to believe someone was dangerous. They just needed fear. And the grave became the place where that fear was acted out with knives, stones, sickles, and fire. These aren't legends or folklore. Every story came from court records, archaeological digs, and medieval chronicles. History was darker than any horror movie. Subscribe to see more facts Hollywood never showed you.